He won the double when English football swore it couldn't be done. He built the first British side ever to lift a European trophy. And right to the end of his life, in a modest house near the ground he served for 55 years, Bill Nicholson was still asked the same question. Which was the greatest? Nicholson arrived at Tottenham in 1936, a 17-year-old ground staff boy on £2 a week. He played 341 games for the club, won a single England cap, and scored with his first touch 19 seconds in. Then, on 11th October 1958, he was handed a team near the bottom of the First Division. That afternoon, Spurs beat Everton 10-4. What followed was the greatest era any English club had known. The double in 1961, the first of the 20th century. The FA Cup again in 1962. The European Cup Winners' Cup in 1963, the first European trophy won by a British club. Another FA Cup in 1967, 2 League Cups, the UEFA Cup in 1972. 8 major trophies in 16 years, built on short passing and a refusal to win ugly. His verdict carries weight no pundit can match. He didn't watch these men from a studio. He signed them, coached them, argued with them, dropped them, lifted trophies beside them. Across his interviews and memoirs, 5 names rose above the rest. The order will start arguments. One is almost forgotten by modern fans. One relationship nearly tore a dressing room apart. And the man Nicholson placed at the very top? Not the one most people would guess. Stay with me to the end. The name is Dave Mackay, not Jimmy Greaves, not Danny Blanchflower. For years, Nicholson refused to answer the question at all because there were simply too many candidates. Greaves, Pat Jennings, Cliff Jones, John White, Mike England, Alan Mullery, Alan Gilzean, Cyril Knowles, Martin Chivers, Martin Peters. When he finally committed himself in his autobiography, he chose the Scot from Musselburgh, and he admitted most people would have assumed he'd say Greaves, because the game is about scoring goals, and nobody scored like Jimmy. He signed Mackay from Hearts on 16th March 1959, just before the deadline, for around £30,000. Spurs finished 18th that season. Mackay played only 4 games before injury ended his campaign. Nothing about that first spring suggested history was coming. What Nicholson remembered instead was the first morning Mackay walked into the training ground. Spurs already had a squad packed with seasoned internationals, men who thought they knew what commitment looked like. Nicholson described them glancing at one another as if to ask what on earth was happening. A 24-year-old had walked in and raised the temperature of the entire club inside a single session. That was the relationship from day one. Nicholson never had to motivate Dave McCoy. He had to build a team worthy of him. 2 years later, Tottenham won their first 11 league games of the season, scored 115 goals in 42 matches, took the title by 8 points, and beat Leicester at Wembley to complete the double. Mackay was the engine room. Cliff Jones always said the side was already excellent before he arrived. What it lacked was that final, brutal will to win. Nicholson's own judgment was blunt. Mackay probably did more than any other man to forge a team capable of winning the double. Read that again. Not helped, forged. He was also far more skillful than the hardman legend allows. Nicholson praised his delicate touch, 2 good feet, and a reading of the game so sharp that it came as no surprise when Brian Clough later turned him into a sweeper at Derby. He broke the same leg twice and came back stronger both times. He captained Spurs to the 1967 FA Cup. He left in 1968 after 318 appearances and 51 goals. Nicholson had only one reason for not making him captain immediately. He already had a great one. Most people, hearing the second name, expect a goalkeeper. Pat Jennings played 472 games for Nicholson and is still, for many, the finest keeper the club ever had. But the name Nicholson kept coming back to was John White. If you're under 50, you may never have seen him play. White is the great missing man of English football, a player frozen forever at 27. He nearly didn't sign him. In October 1959, White was a slight, pale 22-year-old at Falkirk, and his frail appearance had already put off a string of First Division clubs. Nicholson hesitated too. What convinced him was the testimony of his own players. Blanchflower and Mackay had both played alongside White for Scotland and vouched for him without reservation. Then the army told Nicholson the boy was a celebrated cross-country runner. That settled it. £22,000 and done. That first impression was not immediately vindicated. Nicholson played him out of position at inside left, and the performances were flat. The manager solved it himself, shifting him to inside right, and the team took flight. They called him the Ghost of White Hart Lane. He was quicker than anyone realized, tireless, and blessed with the rarest gift in football. He knew what was about to happen before anyone else on the pitch. Defenders did not lose him because he beat them. They lost him because he was simply somewhere else. The raw numbers barely begin to explain him. In one stretch, Spurs missed him for 15 matches and won only one of them. He was ever present in the double season. He scored twice in the first leg against Rangers in the Battle of Britain. He won the FA Cup in 1962 and the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1963. Then, on 21st July 1964, sheltering under a tree from a thunderstorm on a golf course in Enfield, he was struck by lightning and killed. He was 27. Nicholson called it a tremendous blow, and those who knew him said he never spoke about it easily again, because here is the part that still hurts. Blanchflower was finishing. Nicholson had already told White the next Tottenham team would be built around him. The greatest side he never managed died on that golf course. Some players follow instructions. Danny Blanchflower argued with them. He was Nicholson's captain, his on-field brain, and for a period, his biggest headache. A Belfast electrician's apprentice who lied about his age to join the RAF, trained as a navigator, and treated football as a subject to be debated rather than a job to be done. Twice Footballer of the Year, in 1958 and 1961. The Times would later rank him the greatest player in Tottenham's history. He was also the first man in Britain to refuse "This is your life," walking away from the cameras in 1961 at the absolute peak of his fame, purely because nobody had asked him first. Their relationship almost ended before it began. In January 1959, months into Nicholson's reign, with results collapsing, the new manager dropped his most famous player for a younger, more defensive option. Blanchflower promptly asked for a transfer. Then Spurs were humiliated in the FA Cup by Norwich, and Nicholson did something a lesser manager could never have done. He brought him straight back and made him captain a fortnight later. That decision built the double. It also told every player in that dressing room where the manager's ego ended. What Nicholson understood was that Blanchflower's arrogance was inseparable from his value. He made the decisions on the pitch that no manager can make from the touchline. He never missed a penalty. He scored one in the 1962 FA Cup final against Burnley. He lifted the double in 1961 and the Cup Winners' Cup in 1963, in his penultimate season. He is also the reason Tottenham's identity exists at all. His line about the game being about glory, about doing things in style and going out to beat the lot, is carved into the front of the stadium today. Nicholson's own philosophy ran alongside it. Better to fail aiming high than to succeed aiming low. And yet, in the most Nicholson twist imaginable, when he later picked his best-ever Spurs side, he selected Ron Burgess and Mackay in midfield and joked that Danny could captain the reserves, who'd probably beat them anyway. Blanchflower's son called it cheating. It was really the highest compliment a man like Nicholson knew how to pay. Nobody in the history of English football finished a chance like the fourth man, Jimmy Greaves. Nicholson bought him in December 1961, 6 months after the double, and he built the deal around a psychological detail rather than a financial one. The fee was £99,999, deliberately £1 short of six figures, so that Greaves would never carry the label of the first £100,000 footballer in Britain. The doubts were real. Greaves had just failed at AC Milan, scoring 9 in 14, but clashing badly with a coach whose defensive regime he loathed. He had been out of English football. Chelsea wanted him back. The negotiations dragged. He answered everything on the 16th of December 1961. A hat-trick on his league debut against Blackpool, a 5-2 win, and the first three of what became 266 goals for Tottenham. A club record that stood for half a century until Harry Kane. Nicholson's assessment was simple. Greaves was the best striker of his era, with a goal record far superior to Denis Law, George Best, or Bobby Charlton. The evidence piled up fast. He scored after 3 minutes of the 1962 FA Cup final against Burnley. He scored twice in the 1963 Cup Winners' Cup final as Spurs dismantled Atletico Madrid 5-1 and became the first British club to win in Europe. He finished as Tottenham's top scorer in all 9 of his seasons there. For England, he scored 44 in 57 games, including a record 6 hat-tricks. He changed matches on his own, and he did it without visible effort, which was precisely what made him so hard for a manager like Nicholson to categorize. Everything Nicholson valued was about work. Everything Greaves did looked like instinct. Effort was Nicholson's religion, and Greaves scored his goals like a man barely even trying. That tension eventually decided his fate. After a shock FA Cup defeat at Crystal Palace in January 1970, Nicholson dropped several senior players. The others fought their way back. Greaves never played for Tottenham again and was sold to West Ham in March in the deal that brought Martin Peters north. Greaves later called it the biggest regret of his career. Nicholson never disowned the decision, but he never disowned the player either. The last name comes with an argument attached. Martin Chivers. Their relationship was described by the player himself as love-hate, and that is generous. Nicholson thought Chivers wasn't aggressive enough. Critics called him lazy and slow, which was nonsense. He was the fastest man at the club, over 60 yards. But the manager wanted visible fury, and Chivers played with a kind of unhurried, upright grace that looked, to a Yorkshireman raised on hard work, like indifference. He arrived from Southampton in 1968 as a British record signing for a forward. Then he suffered a devastating knee injury that could have ended everything. For a long stretch, the doubts were entirely reasonable ones. He was Tottenham's top scorer in 1971-72 with 25 goals, and finished top again in each of the next 2 seasons. The man his manager called insufficiently aggressive simply would not stop scoring goals. What changed him was survival. He came back, and he came back scoring. Twice in the 1971 League Cup final win over Aston Villa. But the moment that defines the whole relationship came on the 3rd of May 1972 at Molineux in the first leg of the very first UEFA Cup final. Chivers has said Nicholson was furious with the first half performance and that there was another major bust-up in the dressing room at the interval. The players went back out telling their big striker they knew what he could do. He then scored both goals in a 2-1 win, the second an unstoppable strike from 25 yards in the closing moments. Spurs drew the second leg 1-1 and became the first British club to win 2 different European trophies. That is the reason he belongs on this list. Not because he and Nicholson understood each other, they often didn't, but because the friction produced something neither man could have produced alone. The manager pushed him precisely where he was uncomfortable, and Chivers responded by becoming the most feared English centre-forward in Europe. He scored 174 goals in 367 games for Tottenham, won 2 League Cups and the UEFA Cup, and remained the club's leading European scorer until 2013. Nicholson resigned in 1974, ground down by the game he had given his life to. Chivers left 2 years later. Two stubborn men who never quite became friends, and who, for one season, were unstoppable together. 5 names, 5 completely different reasons. Dave McCoy, chosen above everyone as the best signing he ever made because he changed the temperature of an entire football club. John White, the ghost, whose genius was interrupted at 27 and who was meant to be the foundation of everything that came next. Danny Blanchflower, the argumentative captain who gave Tottenham a philosophy that outlived them all. Jimmy Greaves, the purest finisher English football has produced. And Martin Chivers, the most complicated of them, whose conflict with his manager forged a European champion. Notice what this list is not. It is not a ranking of statistics. If it were, Greaves tops it without discussion. Nicholson picked with a manager's memory. Training grounds, dressing rooms, arguments, injuries, trust earned slowly and expensively. Mackay wasn't first because of his goals. He was first because of what happened to everybody else when he walked through the door. The most surprising choice is John White, a name too many fans have never heard. The most emotional is Chivers, because that story only worked through friction. And no list from Bill Nicholson can ever be neutral. Pat Jennings, Cliff Jones, Alan Gilzean, and Alan Mullery all have supporters who will tell you this is wrong. So tell me, which of these 5 surprised you most? Who has been left out that you would put in? And who would you drop to make room? Build your own top 5 in the comments. I read them all. And tell me which city and country you're watching from. It's always the best part of my day. If you enjoyed this, hit the like button. It helps the channel reach more football fans. Subscribe for more stories from the golden age of the English game and turn on notifications. Next time, the manager who won everything and walked away from it all.